Greetings, salams, and welcome to the fourth episode in our pioneering series, Empires, Converts and Community, connecting with Britain's Muslim heritage. My name is Tariq Hussain, and I will be your host once again as we discuss influential and forgotten British Muslim personalities, important Muslim heritage spaces, as well as how we might connect with them today. As our regular viewers know, these episodes are set during the end of the 19th century and the start of the 20th. When the world witnessed the gradual decline and abolition of two of history's largest empire states, the British and the Ottomans. It also witnessed the start of two world wars and, in Britain, the establishment of its very first Muslim communities. Over the past 3 weeks, we have mapped the British Islamic presence from the 7th century right up to the present day. We have also explored Britain's first Sheikhul Islam, Abdullah Quilliam's relationship with the Ottomans. And last week, we learned about Pan-Islamism, the Indian Khilafah, and its connections to several fascinating early London Muslim activists. Throughout these sessions, we have pointed to heritage spaces and artifacts that offer tangible ways people can connect with this little-known British history, such as King Offa's gold coin in the British Museum, Quilliam's Mosque in Liverpool, and the Muslim heritage trails in Woking. As Mijan has already said, for those of you that have missed the first 3 episodes, please do check them out on the Everyday Muslim YouTube channel, where eventually recordings of all 6 in our series will be available, including today's episode called The Mecca of Europe, a Jewish-Anglican founder, Britain's first Hajji peer, and an Indian lawyer, which explores the lives of 3 key people in the founding and development of the mosque and Muslim community of Woking: Dr. Wilhelm Gottlieb Leitner, who built the original mosque; the Ahmadiyya missionary and Indian lawyer Khwaja Kamal Uddin, who reopened it; and Lord Headley, a key driving force behind the establishment of the Flourishing Institute. I will also briefly discuss the heritage project completed recently in Woking and the resources created there that allow this history to be accessed by everyone, from tourists to school children. My guests today were originally just 2 of the great authorities in this growing field of study, but I am delighted to reveal we have been joined by a 3rd expert. Our surprise guest is someone I've worked closely with in the past. Marcus Roberts is a historian and founder of the Anglo-Jewish heritage trails, JTrails. But most importantly, he is a growing expert on Dr. Wilhelm Gottlieb Leitner. I also have with me my 2 original headline guests who between them have written some of the most important books on Britain's Muslim heritage in recent years. Firstly, Professor Ron Geaves, author of, amongst others, Islam in Britain, Muslim Mission in an Age of Empire, and Dr. Jamie Gilham, who's just finished writing the first ever biography of Lord Headley. Thank you all for agreeing to be on the show today. Just a quick reminder, we will take questions at the end, so do feel free to type them in and I will pick them up towards the end of the session. So let's start with you, Marcus. Very briefly, tell us who was Leitner by detailing a bit about his background and upbringing, if you will. And to set you off, Mijan, if we can have that wonderful picture to start us off of the Leitner family in Istanbul, please.
So, yeah, I should preface this that I started looking at Leitner and I realized that too little was known about his background, and in particular his Jewish background. So as part of the Jewish Country House project, I set myself the task of delving into the archives and trying to extract a bit more information about Leitner and his early life and about his Jewishness. And how that related to other religions, in particular Islam. So the searches proved to be very interesting. So Leitner was born a Hungarian Jew. He was brought up in a household which spoke Yiddish and Hungarian, and Hebrew was obviously one of the languages of the house. He looked set for a sort of middle-class Jewish Enlightenment family upbringing, but sadly his father died when he was very young, and his mother decided to remarry and she was introduced to Dr. Leitner Senior, as it turns out, who was a medical doctor in Turkey. So it appears that the Scottish Missionary Society made the match, and so Leitner, as a young boy, was moved along with his family to Galat in Turkey, and his father, Dr. Leitner, was a learned man who'd originally been destined to become a rabbi, it said, and in order to make ends meet, he had become a doctor, a respected military doctor. And in 1844, he read some tracts provided by the London Society for the Promotion of Christianity among the Jews, which led to him becoming a Christian. But his identity was as a Jewish Christian, as the London Society did promote the retention of a Jewish identity, and they had their own Jewish operatives chapels in London. And after a while, he was appointed as their chief missionary in Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. So he moved with his young family to Constantinople, and the picture that you see is this remarkable picture, which has been identified recently, of the reassembled Leitner family. So you have Dr. Leitner Senior at the front with wife, and then you have Elizabeth and young Leitner himself at the rear. So it is a remarkable picture. While he was in Turkey, his father seemed to want him to become a missionary, possibly or probably to the Jews and Muslims. And so his father put him onto an incredible educational course of linguistic learning. He sent him to just about every school that was available in Constantinople. So he went to an Armenian school, he went to a Greek school, a Greek college, a German school. He possibly studied in a Jewish convert school and possibly learned the Dino there. And then he was sent to be finished off to a Protestant missionary college in Malta, which also taught another 8 languages. By this stage, it was evident that young Leitner had a capacity for languages, and so his father, fixed upon this course of exposing him to just about every language possible in Turkey. So on average, he'd spend a year at the school, he'd learn the language, and then he'd move on to the next thing. The most remarkable thing about his career in Turkey was his father secured a place for him, firstly at an Islamic school, and then at an Islamic college. So he learnt fluent Arabic, he studied Quran, and he also studied Maimonides as it was taught in the Islamic tradition. So by this stage, he was certainly passably Islamic if he wished. He escaped the fate of becoming a missionary because after a year of working as a translator for the British in the Crimea, he then shipped off to England to King's College, and then he went to Germany to study philology, where he got his MA and his doctorate. So he was very, very precocious. He lectured in Mohammedan law and in Arabic and various other things when he was at King's College. So he was a man of remarkable talents, and he has built up a fantastic educational experience. But this man was multicultural. If there's anyone you can say is multicultural and international in outlook, it was Leitner. He could adapt himself to pretty much anywhere that he landed up. He could learn the language, and this is what made him so invaluable, both to the British but also to the native people in India, in the Punjab.
Which is where he ends up, and after this, is that right?
So eventually he took a post for the British College in Lahore, and he made contact with local people and founded a society for the propagation of useful knowledge in the Punjab, and he allied with local Islamic scholars and Sikhs and Parsis to campaign for the foundation of an Oriental college in Lahore. So the British really only wanted sort of lower level Indian civil servants to be educated sufficiently usefully in the government college, but they could see the value of having a university. So with this campaign, working with local people, Leitner succeeded in getting the Oriental College founded in, what's the date? It was 1882. And even on the college website today, the university website today, they refer to him as a Jewish Hungarian by birth, a naturalized Britisher, and an enlightened individual. I think the thing we have to emphasize about Leitner was that he had a remarkable empathy with all the people that he worked with. Mm-hmm. He was not there to missionize them. Clearly, it would seem that he lost his missionary zeal. And in fact, when he was in London, he used to work and promote what were called semi-religious societies. That's to say, a religious outlook which was shorn of its supernaturalism, and its sort of archaic detail, and focused on the kernel of religion in terms of spiritual truth. He highly valued Islam, and he said that Christians would better honor Jesus by honoring Muhammad. So here was a man who was very, very tuned to Islam. He was very friendly with Ahmadiyya Islamic scholars. So a very interesting man altogether. He was very cautious about telling people what he actually believed. But you'll see when we look at his tombstone that there were clues in the tombstone. When
and when he was, sorry, Marcus, when he was in the, is it in the Punjab that he founds this first Oriental College that you've mentioned? Because we've got this picture, haven't we, where he's the principal. Next slide, please, Mijam. And if you just want to tell us about this picture and its connection to maybe the college you've mentioned.
Yeah, so he founds the University of Lahore. So this, by the way, this image you're seeing is of the first institution he was the head of. He remained the head of that institution, but that's the government college which trains Indian civil servants.
I see. Okay.
So he founded the college. He founded the university, and the key thing about the university was that it honoured and used local culture and languages. Mm-hmm. So it used the principal local languages as well as Sanskrit and Arabic. The British didn't like that because they wanted it to teach in English, but he was insistent that local languages and culture should be heeded, and he also advocated widespread improvement of education in the Punjab. He said that the British had destroyed the native education system in the Punjab, which before the British arrived had been exceptional. And so, alongside working on the university, he did a lot of work working with primary schools. He founded 100 primary schools in the Rawalpindi circle, including at least 60 for primary schools for Muslim girls. So this is a remarkable person. And he was an anti-colonialist. So whilst he was working for the British, he was regarded as a rather dangerous liberal type by the British.
And is it fair to say this is why he seemed to, show such value for the local culture, the local heritage? And as you've pointed out, he really wanted to highlight how amazing the education system already was prior to the British arrival.
Yeah. So I mean, he's very well esteemed by Sikh scholars who point out how he really helped the Sikh people, and also recognised the Sikh written literature, because the British didn't want to recognise the Sikh literary oeuvre, but he proved that there was one, and it should be included.
Wonderful. So after this, if we can, just because we've got to fast forward a little bit now. Okay. So after this, we know that he makes his way to Britain, where of course he has this grand vision of an Oriental college, which leads to the building of the Shah Jahan Mosque. How did that all come about?
So what he's doing, as soon as he'd founded the university in Lahore, he went on sickness furlough to England, and he wanted to set up the mirror organization in Woking. So he had got his Oriental College or university in Lahore, and he was setting up the satellite or the sister organization in London. So he wanted to promote the study of classical languages and Indian culture. And of course, a lot of the money for this came from the local Indian rulers. He was well in with them because they liked him. So this was not a British endeavour as such. It was more
Next slide, please, Mijambe.
it was more of a subaltern initiative. So the Indian rulers and intelligentsia wanted their own reverse influence in the home country. So in some ways, it could be considered perhaps a little subversive. Obviously, you're also showing a picture of some of his Gandharan art and other collections. I should emphasize that one of the big things that Leitner did was to be one of the early collectors of so-called Gandharan art or Greco-Buddhist art, sort of stuff that the Taliban destroyed more recently, the big Buddha that they destroyed. He wasn't the first person to discover it, but he was the person who really collected a lot and argued that it wasn't just some decadent version of Greek art, but it was a genuine Indian cultural production. Because obviously, if you look at these sculptures here, they've both got Greek elements, but there's also, quite strong Indian stylistic elements. The colonial British wanted to say it was just a decadent copy, whereas Leitner wanted to argue that it was genuinely, Greco-Indian. So once again, he was honouring the local culture, and he spent most of the rest of his life trying to promote his collection around Europe. And,
did he bring the collection with him, Marcus? Was it brought to the college that he set up? And I think we've got a slide next, which will show the building that he acquired. This was originally the Royal Dramatic College, and it fell on hard times, of course. And Leitner comes along and buys it. Is that right, Marcus?
Sort of. So that's the main college building. However, where the mosque is now was an extension of the campus, and that was where he planned a multi-faith campus. So he intended not just a mosque, but also a temple and a synagogue, as well as a church. So the fact that there was only a mosque there now, in a sense, gives you a false impression of what was intended. It may be that the foundations of the Hindu temple were laid at the site, but he died before it could be completed. And the initial money, since it had come from the rulers of in the Punjab, was naturally for the Islamic part of it. But this man was a interfaith figure even before the first international interfaith conference had taken place.
It's quite a visionary.
So this is where the study would have taken place. But if you've got a slide of the lodge.
Indeed, yes. Next slide, please, Mijambo.
So whilst this building looks relatively modest today, this was actually used primarily as his museum for Gandharan art. So it was the first place in Europe where Gandharan art was displayed.
Wow.
And
it has a very strange name. Do you want to tell us about that?
No, you can tell me.
So it's Sir Salah Jung Memorial Hall, which of course is the name of one of the prime ministers of Hyderabad. And so, as I understand it, Marcus, is that where some of the money came for this?
Yeah, I think so. Yes, I believe so. So as I said, it's a subaltern initiative. It actually reflects an Indian influence, not a British colonial influence. So these are people in India wanting to have a back influence, and possibly wanting to cultivate something in England. But going back to the collection he had in there was solely devoted to Gandharan art, and it was regarded in its time as a very remarkable collection. Now, sadly, this collection is also titled the Wandering Collection because he sent it all around Europe to various congresses and to various exhibitions, trying to popularize the art, particularly at the Vienna International Exhibition. But sadly, he never managed to get a home in a major museum for it. So he won an educational prize at the Vienna exhibition. But it was only after his death that elements of the collection were auctioned off and found their way into some of the museums. Basically, Indian art simply was not valued, particularly so after the Indian Revolt. And by 1910, academics were writing that India has no art. So you can see what Leitner was up against, even in his own lifetime. and whilst the collection of Indian artifacts in the British Museum were very popular, Indian art and culture was merely presented as a sort of a place where you could go and look for design inspiration. So it was seen, more as a
and talking of design, I think our next slide, Mijambe, if we can just flick to that. Yeah, this is something you've identified in the design of the actual Shah Jahan Mosque, which of course, as you pointed out, is the only religious building that Leitner was able to see completed. Do you want to tell us about this design, please?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously we don't have proof that it is so, but it would certainly suggest that Leitner was reflecting his own Jewish background in the design of these windows, but also perhaps his sense of there being of a kinship among faiths. So he was a very interfaith figure, and I think he saw spiritual truth as being something shared between religions. So I think it gives us a little clue to his own Jewish background.
Indeed. And then when we go to his tomb, we have something similar going on there, don't we? So,
Yes.
Mijambe, if you can put his tomb up, and I don't know if our viewers can see this very clearly, but right at the bottom there, we have some Arabic inscriptions, don't we?
Well, the thing I should just first of all mention is that, that the plot that he's in is a separate plot with a handful of other graves, and these are mostly, it would appear, of Jewish Christians. So these are people who are Jewish but converted to Christianity. So it's a little plot unto itself. It doesn't have obvious religious symbolism until you look at the main plaque, the main inscription, and you can see that it's a truncated version of a Maltese cross. So there is a cross on there, and it might even refer back to the Protestant Theological College in Malta. We also have a reference to Hebrew with one of the inscriptions, and of course we've got the Islamic inscription as well. So you've got the three faiths which made up his background and the main influence of his life. So you've got the Islam, you've got the Judaism, and you've got the Christianity. But none of them stand out or are touted as the main identity. And indeed, just before he died, a report from the Jewish Chronicle spoke to him in Bonn, and he refused to be drawn on where his religious sentiments really lay. I don't think he saw himself as particularly one thing or other, but I think that his main empathy was with Islam, I think.
Yeah, and actually we see that not only with the fact that his choice for the first building was a mosque, but also, of course, around the corner from his tomb, he also secured a plot of land 4 years before he even built the mosque for a Islamic Muslim cemetery, which was known as the Mohammedan cemetery. And it is, as far as we know, because we recently had a blue plaque installed there, it is the oldest Muslim burial site in Britain.
And you see, what he did there was actually quite Jewish as well. So within Jewish tradition, if you're founding a community, you might want to establish the cemetery first before the synagogue. But certainly within the Jewish sentiment, the importance of having a Jewish burial place available is very, very high. So I think he may, also translate that into the Islamic sentiment. I imagine in the Islamic community there's a similar idea of the importance of being able to receive proper Islamic burial. And it's interesting that the memorial stone there gives simple instructions on how to conduct an Islamic funeral.
The Qibla stone that he installed in order to recognize it. That's absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for that, Marcus. So that kind of brings us nicely up to the moment when we have this mosque building here, and now if I can pick it up with you, Professor Geaves. So Leitner dies, and what happens next?
Well, I think before going into that particular question, the one person, of course, we've forgotten here, and I think it's Marcus, of course, points out that a number of Indian rulers were involved, in trying to establish Leitner's vision. Of course, it's the Shah Jahan Mosque.
Yes.
And so we shouldn't forget the fact that there is a significant commitment financially from the Sultan Shah Jahan, who was an Indian female ruler of a dynasty of female rulers. Interestingly enough, there were 4 of them in Bhopal. And of course, the significance, and it might be a good idea to put the first slide there.
Yes, because we have one of those begums visiting later, don't we? So
we do
Mijan, if you
indeed.
can put up the slide afterwards, please.
Yeah.
After to the tomb.
And so yes, it is named after her, and for me I think that's quite a fascinating and significant fact that the first mosque in the UK is named after a female Muslim, rather than,
Yes,
or at least the first purpose-built mosque. Anyway, we won't argue about first. But, so yes, after Leitner's death, I think it's also important to say that not only is there a reverse mission going on during this period from India, which not only Muslims are involved in, but also Hindus are involved in. We get the visit of Vivekananda, of course, to the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago, attempting to offset the kind of, if you want, the way in which Indian religious life, which is so ancient and venerable, has been presented as superstition by Christian missionaries in particular. So there is a reverse mission beginning to go on. There is, of course, already a body, and we'll talk about Islam in particular here, Muslims, a body of Muslims beginning to develop in the UK. We've seen that earlier, of course, in the story of Quilliam's Mosque in Liverpool, but more significantly, London as the capital was attracting wealthy Muslims, students at the universities, diplomats, of course, and so you're beginning to get a body of Muslims beginning to, in a sense, wanting to establish culture as well as faith in the capital. Now, it seems to me that if you're going to establish faith, you need 2 things. You need the man and you need the place. And in Liverpool, you had the man and the place. You had Quilliam and the mosque in Liverpool. But after the demise of that, there was a little bit of a vacuum, in the sense that Islam, although there were little pockets, there was no kind of, if you want, focused way of presenting Islam, not only for the Muslims in London and in Britain, but also to go wider and be daring enough to do what Quilliam had done, which was to actually seek converts. Quilliam had never been sure about Leitner's mosque. He kind of felt that maybe it was more of a cultural enterprise rather than a religious one.
Yeah.
In the sense that not all of the full life of a mosque took place from the Shah Jahan Mosque during Leitner's life. After Leitner's death, there's really no one who picks it up and takes it on. Certainly the accounts, and we're going to talk about Khwaja Kamal Uddin in a moment, but certainly Khwaja Kamal Uddin's accounts of when he first visits the mosque indicate that the place was in some huge disrepair. He talks about spiders' webs and filling the place, and
he finds it quite distressing.
Oh, he finds it very distressing. I mean, he prays inside it with a friend, and his account is that he finds a Quran inside, that's been left inside the building, and they do a random opening of the Quran, and the passage they get would seem to suggest to them that they should bring the mosque back to full use. But by that time, of course, when we come to Khwaja Kamal Uddin, he had already been certainly in the country for some short time. It was picking up on. It was good that Marcus picked up that Leitner had contacts with the Ahmadiyya,
Yes.
because we see that there was that certainly in the correspondences of the early Ahmadiyya founders, that they were aware of the mosque in Woking,
Right.
and that they are certainly aware of a kind of, if you want, the kind of Muslim mission that's beginning to develop in the West from converts. They're aware of William's activities. They're aware of Webb's activities in the US. And so they definitely want to take up that missionary thrust. There's no doubt about that. And I think a part of it, how developed it was, it may have just been in the background, a kind of nascent idea, that when Kamal Uddin came to the UK, there was the possibility of a mosque already existing very close to London. It's hard to.
So they knew about it, didn't they?
They certainly knew about it. Yes, they did. Yeah.
And one of the questions that many people ask now that we've got the Ahmadiyyas in the picture is, a lot of them, often the ones that know a little bit about the history, want to know, was the mosque, quote unquote, an Ahmadiyya mosque, given the Khwaja was clearly an Ahmadiyya missionary?
It's a complex question.
Okay.
And I'm gonna take it through with a little bit of detail, I think, and get some dates in there. Khwaja Kamal Uddin arrived in London on the 24th of September in 1912. Now, it's important to realize that he did not come as an Ahmadiyya missionary. Although he had gone to the Caliph of the Ahmadiyya and told him that he was going to London, and the Ahmadiyya was certainly very excited about the fact that he was going to London. He actually came to deal with a court case. He was a lawyer, and he came to deal with a court case for an Indian plaintiff, which required him coming to London. That was the main reason for him coming to the UK. We do know that he had gone and spoken to the Caliph. And it's important to realize that there's no doubt whatsoever from quite an early age, I think it was 21, 22, he'd first come across the founder of the Ahmadiyya, as many brilliant young men did at that time. He was seen as a very significant Islamic reformer. He was attracting young, educated Muslims. I mean, Kamal Uddin himself had been educated in the Christian Foreman College in the Punjab, which was quite a famous establishment, and his father was a High Court judge, and he'd gone on himself and made a career for himself in law. So he had been groomed. There's no doubt about it. The number of these young men had been groomed by the founder of the Ahmadiyya, who very much saw the resurgence of Islam, or what he saw he saw a resurgence of Islam would appear not from the Eastern world, but from the heart of the Western world. So it was very much a part of his vision that Islam would revive itself from the West, not from the East. So these young men have been groomed, and there's no doubt about it that Kamal Uddin was one of them. When he came to London, and of course he initially he has this court case to deal with, but we find him immediately beginning to look, and also certainly when I say cometh the man, he begins to look at the condition of the Muslims in London in terms of not their material life, but their spiritual life. So we find him going to the universities and looking at the Muslim students. Do they have facilities to pray? Do they have facilities for Juma? Do they have facilities for Eid? And he begins to organize them, first by renting places where Juma can take place and where Eid can take place. So he immediately begins to pick up the religious life, if you want, of the Muslim community in London. Now, in the course of this period, we get this visit, which he takes to the mosque in Woking, to the Shah Jahan Mosque. And there is a period of time when he begins to negotiate with the trustees, the existing trustees of the mosque, And
Who were they
eventually,
at the time? Sorry, Professor
oh,
Geaves. Who were these trustees?
now you got me stuck, I'm afraid.
Okay.
I do
I
know them.
apologize.
I do know them, but I'd have to go and look them up.
Of course. No, carry on, please. Carry on.
But they were certainly prominent leading diplomats and figures in London from the Muslim community. He then starts to negotiate with them, and certainly after a course of negotiation, finally the mosque is essentially, or certainly he is allowed to become the imam of the mosque. Sometime in, maybe I probably even have the dates. It doesn't take that long. So let me see.
1913?
It's 1913. I'm trying to get the exact date. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, August. So it's so it's not that long a period. He's been in the UK for 12 months, you can say, effectively. When he takes on the mosque and he begins to establish the pattern by which he's going to promote Islam, there are a number of elements which I think are quite similar to the way that William approached Islam. One was working with converts, seeing what how that could take place, what kind of openings there were to preach Islam to a wider audience than the Muslims already existing. Developing publications, and it seems to me that one of the first fallouts that he has with the Ahmadiyya movement back in Qadian is that they want to give him their publications, and he says no. I will develop my own publication that's suitable for Britain and for a British audience.
And this is the Islamic Review.
Yes, this is the Islamic Review.
Yeah.
So, and he begins to find various platforms through which he can meet people, places like the Theosophical Society and various other organizations where there's an East-West dialogue or link, and where they'd be open for him to speak. We see him. I think where he differs from Quilliam is that whereas Quilliam seemed to have a genius for reaching all sectors of the population as far as conversion was concerned, particularly into the working classes of Liverpool, I think the Khwaja, by background and tradition and heritage, is more at ease with his own class, and and that's the class which he finds most of his contacts with, including I think his first convert was a woman, actually, Ibrahim, and so we see him begin. Now, once he's established a base, in other words, we've now got the man and we've got the place.
Yeah.
We've got the mosque, which so and of course that then becomes a center from which not only can he promote Islam but also hold Islamic activities, prayers, Eids, and so on.
And we've got some pictures of that. So Mijan, if you can flip through a couple.
Yeah, I
carry on, Professor.
I think we've got Eid 1916. Yes, there we go.
Yes, there we go.
So, yeah, where was I? So there's then this issue of his relationship between Qadian. Qadian, of course, now see they have got their foothold in the UK. So their vision of, if you want, of being at the forefront of promoting Islam in the West and this Islamic resurgence from the West, they see that as the possibility of that taking place, and they begin to send out over a course of years a number of missionaries, and these people are sent as missionaries. They're not like Kamal Uddin, who comes as a lawyer and then decides to work to help British Muslims. They come as missionaries. Now, the first one of those who come, Sayal, almost immediately falls out with Kamal Uddin, with the Khwaja, and it would seem that the falling out takes place over what should be promoted. And this is where I think, although Kamal Uddin never denies his Ahmadiyya origins, he feels very, very strongly that in a land where people don't even know what Islam is,
Indeed.
you know,
Indeed. Sectarianism isn't going to get you very far.
sectarianism is not going to get you very far. And how do you start with the Ahmadiyya slant on Islam when people don't even know what the basics are?
Precisely. Yeah.
So his vision then is not to pursue the Ahmadiyya message, but to pursue the basics of the teachings of Islam. And to put right, just as Quilliam tried to put right as well, some of the misconceptions of Islam that exist in the Western world during that period of time. So you begin to give him look in a very similar kind of thrust that Quilliam had, where trying to present lectures that not only show the basics of Islam and what it taught and its relationship to the Abrahamic religions, which a lot of people weren't really aware of, but also to show its role in civilization, the development of civilization, its role, that it wasn't just a stranger to the Western world, that they had known about each other for a long, long time, looking at places like Spain as an example, of Islam established on European soil, and so on. So you see him embarking. Now, Sayal doesn't like this at all. And Sayal says, no. We have to present the Ahmadiyya message, because there is particularly the message that the founder was a prophet.
Yeah.
And Kamal Uddin doesn't go down that road at all. Says that's far too complex, the whole issue over prophethood. We really don't need to do that. And they fall out, and Sayal says, okay, I'm leaving. I'll set up the Ahmadiyya mission elsewhere.
Right.
And he moves to London. He begins what's called the London Muslim Mission, and Khwaja Kamal Uddin founds the Woking Muslim Mission.
Right.
So, and of course, the Sayal's mission, the London Muslim Mission, eventually goes on to establish what's known as the London Mosque in Southfields, Wimbledon, around about 1924. So that becomes their main location, and still is to this day the main location of the Ahmadiyya.
Indeed, that very much has an obvious Ahmadiyya identity, doesn't it? Whereas
it does.
with Woking, clearly the waters are murky. And one of the things that I find interesting early on as well, Professor Geaves, is that you see on the front covers of the Islamic Review, the early ones, there's this broad proclamation that there are no sects in Islam, constantly being repeated.
Indeed, and I think right the way through Woking Mosque's history was it with a number of imams, and let's be frank, most of those imams were Ahmadiyya, but they were from the Lahori branch of the Ahmadiyya, not Qadian, where there is no belief, or there is a departure of belief around the founder's status. They just see him as a reformer, and not in any sense as a continuation of prophethood.
Right.
So they're much more orthodox around the seal of the prophet, ending with Muhammad.
Indeed.
So, but even it's very interesting. I have a friend who took his shahada from the Woking Mosque in the early 1960s.
Yes.
And he said even at that time when he went, there were a number of things that impressed him, and he told me that certainly at that time the imam that he met with was a Lahori Ahmadiyya imam. What amazed him was that they were so much more developed in dealing with Western people turning up wanting to know about Islam than, say, any of the migrant mosques, who I think were not really set up for that, as arguably are not even to this day. So he was very impressed by the fact that it was not strange for them to have Westerners turning up. But also he sent me some material of Eid in the early 1960s, where the speaker that they had invited for the Eid was a prominent leader of the Shia community in the UK. So I think they always maintained right from, I think this was a part of the vision of the Khwaja, that there could not be room for sectarianism inside, in any attempt to secure Islam in this country, because if you did, you just raised
Alienate.
you just alienated everybody.
Mm.
You know, so he certainly had this vision of inviting all Muslims to come and feel free to worship and pray there, you know, regardless of sect or, you know, or background or whatever. And certainly that, I think, was a part of the Woking Mosque's vision right the way through.
And clearly played a big part in the success, which of course leads to it being dubbed in some quarters as the Mecca of Europe. And what was it that made it so pivotal? What kind of other activities, if you can just give us an insight of one or two other things that might have gone on there? I mean, one of the things that we've heard is obviously we've seen pictures, some of us, of great leaders of Muslim countries arriving at the mosque, and that clearly gave it some prominence. But what was it that made it such a pivotal place, in your opinion?
In my opinion, I think there are a number of elements. I mean, the first element, of course, is that it has this wonderful, which we visage, if you want. I mean, the first time I visited, which was quite a long time ago, I was absolutely stunned by this beautiful little, you know, perfect, you know, mosque in you know, just outside London. Absolutely. So, you know, so whereas Quilliam had to operate with a Georgian terrace,
Indeed.
I mean, Kamal Uddin gets
this is far more easier for the Instagram feed, huh, Professor G?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So I mean, anybody coming, there is no doubts what they're coming to. You know what I mean? So that I think that earns it, in a sense, the Mecca of Europe. You know, immediately, because anything else has got to be built. You know, and this is there with all of Leitner's vision, you know, and his love for the Orient manifested in the building. You're right about rulers, and I found, in fact, I almost was going to put it as a slide. Actually, I should have done, because there was I found a slide of Haile Selassie.
Yes.
Yes. Visiting, you know, so it becomes a place which just, you know, and also some of the rulers of the Arab states, including Saudi.
And
you know,
King
so,
Faisal.
Yes,
as a prince,
exactly.
as a prince, he turned
as
up.
a prince, yes, he turns up. You know, so in that sense, I think everybody across the Muslim world knows, certainly before the establishment of, say, Regent's Park Mosque, that this is the location from which is the beacon of Islam goes out from this place in Woking, not only in Britain, of course, but also into Europe.
Indeed.
You know, so
yeah, and I think you know, and we'll probably come back to this a little bit later as well. I think the success of the Khwaja's founding magazine, the Islamic Review, had a big part to play in that as well. You know, it really did make the, you know, grab the attention of the international community, because it was being distributed all over the place, wasn't it?
Yeah, everywhere. I mean, in that respect, I think he picks up on Quilliam's
the Crescent,
which of course went out to 80 Muslim nations. So he's aware that can be done, and I think I went through all of them. I did this mass reading, you know, of the review. Actually, funny enough, I did it in the Ahmadiyya headquarters in the Punjab, where they had them all in their library. And I just sat there and just read through them one by one by one by one.
They're fascinating.
They're incredibly fascinating, and you begin to get this story of not only the way in which he presented Islam, but also the story of the kind of world he's beginning to build, in which Islam can be, and again, I have to say this goes back to Quilliam too, in which Islam can be seen as something which is a part of a Western heritage, not just something that comes from abroad. Intellectually, culturally, spiritually, it can belong to the West as it belongs to the East, and I think that's the genius of these, of those two, Quilliam and Kamal Uddin.
And in the Khwaja's case, of course, which allows us to nicely move on to our final guest. Thank you so much for that, Professor Geaves. And in the Khwaja's case, one of the ways in which he's able to give it this kind of, shall we say, this Western slant, or at least have all the support to be able to be successful in Woking, is because of the pivotal role his good friend Lord Headley plays in establishing the Woking Muslim Mission and the Shah Jahan Mosque activity. But very few of us really know who Lord Headley was, whereas you, on the other hand, Dr. Gilham, have just written his biography and clearly do know him now. So please, tell us a little bit about who this Lordly Mohammedan, as he was known, was.
Yeah, so Lord Headley was 15 years younger than Leitner and 15 years older than Kamal Uddin, quite neatly. He was born in London in 1855 and he died there 80 years later in 1935. And he was a Muslim for the last 22 years of his life. He converted to Islam in 1913 through Kamal Uddin, his mentor. And as you kind of hinted at, I think he's an important figure in the history of Islam in the 20th century in Britain. But he's kind of slightly overlooked or misunderstood, partly because of the influence of William and the scholarly Pictorial. Headley was not a scholar of Islam by any means. But alongside the Aga Khan, I kind of think he's probably or arguably the most recognizable Muslim public figure in Britain between the wars. I can't think of anybody else, so I'm happy to be corrected by people watching this, who was more visible to the general public, and I'm talking about general public as well as Muslims.
It was great PR.
It was fantastic PR, and he was a real character. But he was called upon by the general press, as well as the Islamic press and the colonial press, to kind of talk about Islam and to defend Islam and address matters that concerned Muslims between the two world wars. He didn't always do it very well, but he was there and he was on call. And so I wanted to start with this photo, which was taken in 1893, some 20 years before he converted to Islam. In fact, when this was taken, Lord Headley, as we now know him, was then the Honourable Roland George Allinson Wynne. It's a bit of a mouthful. But he wasn't Lord Headley in 1893. And by today's standards, that is a pretty awful image. Roland sitting on a chair with his Kashmiri boy servant at his feet. But I wanted to begin with it because it kind of hints at some important themes. I know we're short on time, so just tell me to stop if it's too much. But two of those themes are privilege and empire. And of course, they're totally intertwined. But in terms of privilege, I'm thinking about race, class, which Ron's already highlighted, and that's really important in terms of Woking, gender and colonial privilege. So to kind of get back to your real questions, Roland was from a titled family, the Anglo-Irish Allinson Wynnes, the baronets of not one but three localities in England and Ireland. His father, and this is very confusing for a biographer, but his father was also called Roland.
Yeah.
He was the second son, his father, so he didn't succeed to the baronetcy. Whereas Roland Jr., as I'm just going to call him for the minute, he was the eldest of four children and the only son. So he basically was in line to succeed. And since the fourth baron didn't have a male heir, and Roland's father had died, Roland Jr., Lord Headley as we know him, he became the fifth baron in January 1913. And he led a comfortable life for the most part, but the kind of title is slightly misleading to us now. I mean, he wasn't a particularly wealthy man until he married into money very, very late in life. For most of his life, he was cash poor and pretty land rich. He had about 13,000 acres of unproductive and very boggy land with impoverished tenants in the southwest of Ireland, which obviously until the 1920s was part of the UK. And I'm jumping ahead in terms of his biography, but he was declared bankrupt in 1922. But anyway, he went to university, he graduated with a degree in mathematics in 1878, and then tried to get into politics, first through the back door as a kind of secretary to a prominent Conservative MP. And then in the 1892 general election, he stood for Parliament in his family's Irish constituency. which was a completely nationalist stronghold. Coming from an Anglo-Irish landowning family, Roland was a staunch unionist. He was determined to preserve the union between the UK and Ireland. He was a conservative with a capital C and a small c. He was politically very conservative and morally conservative, and he remained so for the rest of his life. But he spectacularly failed in that general election, as was to be expected. He got 86 votes out of around 2,500 within his constituency.
Wow.
But I think the long-term plan was that he would draw on that experience and the contacts and his reputation to further a political career and get a better, more winnable seat. But actually that experience in 1892 just completely turned him off party politics, not surprising. And he turned to something that interested him, which was engineering. And he had a degree in mathematics from Cambridge, so there was a kind of logical step to go into engineering. And he found his professional calling. He really succeeded in that once he came back from India in the late 1890s. But anyway, in this photo here, this first one, 1893, he's aged 38. He's at the very beginning of that civil engineering career.
Mm-hmm.
And his first job, when he had next to no training or practical experience, and again, you know, title and family helps here, he was employed to supervise a really major road construction project in northern India, which leads to that second theme that I kind of mentioned earlier. And in terms of empire, India is really important, I think, to Roland's life and ultimately his religious conversion. His first job, that job I mentioned, overseeing the road construction, was in the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir.
Yeah.
And that led to his first real encounter with a Muslim majority society. Frustratingly, the years that he was in India, which was from 1892 to 97, they're really poorly documented. But we do know that he borrowed from a friend and he read an English edition of the Quran whilst he was in Kashmir. So he started very tentatively, I think, to kind of engage with Islamic culture in which he was immersed for several years. But having said that, he did not convert to Islam for another 20 years when he was almost 60 years old, which takes us on to the next slide, slide 13. And this is one of, if not the most famous image of Lord Headley, as he was known by the time the photo was taken in London in late 1913. So here he is with Kamal Uddin. And of course, this wasn't intentional, but it does make for an interesting juxtaposition with that first photograph. They're both clearly staged photos. The previous one set up in a photographer's studio with a turbaned boy servant at his feet. And now in this one, there's a turbaned Kamal Uddin, a charismatic missionary.
And his mentor.
A mentor, literally standing shoulder to shoulder with the newly created Lord Headley just after he converted to Islam. And it was first published in Islamic Review in early 1914 with the caption, "East meets West in the unity of Islam." So without going into too much detail, but I kind of just want to think about that gap of 20 years between his arrival in India and his conversion to Islam in England. I really do think that Kamal Uddin was the right man in the right place at the right time for Lord Headley.
And how did they meet? Sorry, Jamie, how did they meet?
Well, we don't really know how, we don't really know the exact time that Headley and Kamal Uddin met, but the weird thing, and I think it is a coincidence, they lived almost like very, very close to each other. So Headley became the Baron in January 1913, and then he moved to southwest London, to St Margaret's, near Richmond, which is where Kamal Uddin was actually living until the summer of 1913, as Ron says, before he went to Woking. But just to skip back slightly, I mean, Headley had a profound belief in God. That never seemed to have wavered in his life. But his faith, and we're talking about 1912, 1913 here, his faith was shaken. His faith wasn't shaken, but his confidence in Christianity and the church was disrupted. And he was especially troubled by sectarianism and the power of the priesthood, especially in Ireland, of which he obviously had much experience. But he also referred a lot to the corruption of modern Christianity in terms of dogma, and he was obsessed with priests as mediators between God and humankind. So Kamal Uddin arrived in England in 1912, as Ron says, and began properly propagating Islam in 1913. And that 12-13 period is quite important because Headley was recovering at that time from a total breakdown, which had seen him incarcerated in a Dublin asylum for 5 months in 1911. He'd separated from his wife and mother of his 4 children. 2 of his children had died, one at age 1, a son called Tommy, and then a daughter at birth. And it was actually Tommy's death that he said had kind of set him on a chain of almost total self-destruction. What we now know is a severe kind of bout of depression, which led to heavy drinking, and his marriage failed. And he started to look towards Unitarianism as a viable alternative to Protestantism. And he clearly started to then read about Muhammad as a prophet or a prophet of God. And he probably started looking at the Quran again at that time, probably for the first time, maybe not, I don't know, speculating, probably for the first time since he'd been in India. And then, as I said, he moved to St. Margaret's, right next to Richmond, in early 13. We don't quite know how the contact was made, but they did meet in the summer of 1913, Headley and Kamal Uddin, having corresponded for some weeks. Just for a conservative man like Headley, I think Kamal Uddin was just the acceptable face of Islam and Muslims, not only in terms of that kind of liberal approach. Kamal Uddin talked about the elasticity of Islam and its practice in the West, but also his politics. Kamal Uddin, certainly in 1913, was kind of very vocal about his support for the British Raj, the British in India. And Headley was a total imperialist, especially in terms of his ideas about India. So through Kamal Uddin, he kind of understood Islam to be a simple, tolerant, monotheistic sister faith of Christianity, without priesthood, which is really important to him, and a faith that was free from dogma. And so he believed, free from sectarianism, which you kind of touched on. And there are really kind of common conversion motifs through the Woking mission in the early 20th century. So Kamal Uddin oversaw Headley's conversion to Islam in London in November 1913. And as you kind of said, Tariq, Kamal Uddin did exploit Headley's status and his conversion, especially in the press. And he did use him very effectively to promote Islam in Britain and the Woking mission in particular. But I think that's not to say that Headley was by any means passive. He was a new Muslim, very keen to learn about Islam.
Probably enjoyed the spotlight as well.
And he certainly enjoyed being at the centre of attention. He was quite a performer. But he, having said that, I don't want to kind of be flippant. He was very committed and very serious about the mission and the society that they formed together, which was the British Muslim Society, which became the Muslim Society of Great Britain, to help Muslims in Britain, though I have to say it was pretty London-centric, but also to publicly defend and explain Islam. Slide 14. This is a typical group shot outside Woking Mosque, and it relates to what you and Ron were talking about just now, about the kind of the international importance of Woking. Because here they're celebrating the visit of Abdullah, the Emir of Transjordan, to Woking in November 1922. And I kind of wanted to put it there because it shows Headley literally at the heart of that Woking Muslim community, which had links across the Muslim world. Headley's seated there with a trilby and a walking stick. Next to him is Kamal Uddin in the turban. And then Abdullah. I'm not sure who the next guy is. I'd love to know if anybody can tell me. But the other guy in the trilby is a really good friend of Headley, another convert to Islam, Mr. Lovegrove, who was secretary of the British Muslim Society. And another reason I like the photo is that Leon is sitting to the left, as we look on, to the left of Headley. So Quilliam, or Leon as he was then known, sitting there with a fez.
Indeed. And just talking of converts, because I can see a question coming through. I'm just going to throw it at you while we're here. Did Headley know Lord Stanley, who, of course, was the first Muslim peer, as we understand it?
I don't think there's any connection whatsoever. And Stanley died in 1903. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes.
I haven't found any connection at all between Lord Stanley and Headley. I'm even sceptical about, some people have talked about Quilliam's connection with with Stanley of Oldsleigh. And I don't know that there was a connection.
Right. And one of the things that I did want to ask you, of course, we were talking about how much Lord Headley did, as serious as he was obviously about his faith and his practice, he did enjoy the limelight. And one of the rumours that I came across is that, along with the other famous convert at the time, Sir Archibald Hamilton, is it true that Headley was offered the throne of Albania along with Archibald Hamilton?
Apparently so. I mean, it's a really curious episode. Most discussions about Headley mention it really prominently. I'm more kind of the opinion that it's been rather overemphasized, not least because, as I understand it, Headley was one of many Muslims and non-Muslims who was approached to become king of Albania.
So it wasn't an exclusive offer?
There was a famous cricketer even, a cricketer called C.B. Fry, who was apparently offered the throne, and Aubrey Herbert, the politician. Many people were offered it. And it's because Albania had declared its independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1912. They then attempted to reinstall its pre-Ottoman kingship, but failed. And it does sound fanciful, but after the First World War, influential Albanians, they were backed by the British Prime Minister, who obviously had some interest in terms of oil, British oil interests in Albania. They did seriously consider appointing a king plucked from the ranks of the British aristocracy. And they struggled, not least because in Britain, Albania was considered to be a poor and lawless country. But I mean, there is a real genuine link. Islam was, and I think still is, the largest religion in Albania.
Yes,
And in
70% plus, I think.
1925, a Muslim delegation did visit Woking Mosque, and it was at that point that they offered the throne to both Headley and his really good friend, Archibald Hamilton.
I mean, personally, I would love to have seen them both rule together.
I wouldn't. I really wouldn't. Headley said publicly that he'd been offered the throne 3 times, not just once. I think he was trying to outdo Hamilton.
Right.
He was only offered it once, and Hamilton was very clear that he wanted no part in it. Headley is interesting. He kind of played the game for a bit. So he says he was offered it 3 times, and then he publicly said he didn't want it. But then he kind of changed tact. He'd been declared bankrupt, as I said, a few years earlier. His second marriage had just failed, and he was really short on cash. So he went public and said that if they gave him 100 grand as a lump sum and a £10,000 salary, he'd consider accepting the kingship.
How absolutely fascinating.
His demands weren't taken seriously in Albania, and the throne was restored in 1958.
So on that note, I'm just conscious that Mizan's typing furiously at me that we need to start the Q&A, Dr. Gilham. So I do apologise. I know you've got one more picture, but if we can just take a couple of questions and maybe we can come back to that picture. I saw one earlier, which was from Batul, which is perhaps short-lived, however. Might we say that the reason for the converts to Islam fading into the shadows was due to the strong Indian expression of Islam eventually taking hold and driving the British expression underground, to the extent that we find that Islam didn't survive beyond 2nd, 3rd generation convert families? So it's quite a long-winded one, but I think the point being made here is it because of the strong Indian expression of Islam that when families did convert, be it the Quilliams and the Headleys of the world, it didn't continue into the 2nd and 3rd generation as a result of that? Maybe Professor Geaves, you could have a go at that. What do you think? What's your opinion?
Yes, I can have a go at that. I think it's certainly true to say that once you get post-Second World War migrations coming in, of course, the numbers that come in are overwhelmingly large compared to the number of British converts. So, of course, the kind of representation of Islam, in a sense, becomes predominantly subcontinent. Although there's always a small thread of converts that runs through, and in a sense, I think one could say that that thread, in a way, picks up with once you have 2nd and 3rd generation British Muslims coming from the families of the South Asian migrants. They probably have more in common with each other in that respect, as they're both British Muslims rather than Indian. But I would agree. It's also very, very difficult. I mean, one of the the big questions that, I held my chair in the comparative study of religion, and one of the questions in the comparative study of religion is how do you maintain a conversion that takes place not because you are born into a particular faith, so therefore it becomes, your normal cultural habitat, but you actually take another faith. I mean, converts to any faith are quite rare, actually. And how you then continue that, because it comes from a thinking process, a life experience process. And we heard of Headley's, for example, his life crises that he had. All of these things come into conversion. And so they may not come into your children.
Indeed,
in quite
yes.
that way. So your children may continue it because dad did it. On the other hand, they may not. And not all converts have necessarily been. It's not always been a high priority for them that their children continue, their faith. Very often they have the attitude, "Well, I found my faith, you find your faith." So it's a different process, conversion, to being born into it.
And I'm sensing in your answer, you're suggesting it's not necessarily about losing that British expressionism, to use the questioner's term.
No, I don't think it is at all. I think that you were always, when you get a migration experience that was a very large and significant one, and one in this country anyway, not always the case with other migrations, as far as this country is concerned, came from a predominantly post-imperial demand for cheap labor. So many of the people who came were from rural backgrounds. They were uneducated. They were not in the best position to be discovering a British version of Islam.
Exactly.
They had other issues they were trying to deal with. Housing, poverty, and they did a fantastic job in creating our mosque infrastructure that we have in the UK today. We should not forget that. And they did a fantastic job in sacrificing everything to educate their children.
Indeed.
So their children in a way have inherited and don't really have those kind of, if you want, the struggles that the first generation had, and can then have a much more, I think the second and third generation have looked very consciously at this whole issue of culture, citizenship, British identity, and Islam. I think that's been, a big focus of the second and third generation British Muslims in this country.
But it's potentially a luxury as well, given what their parents had to do, Professor.
One might argue that.
Indeed, yes.
I remember seeing some of the first time I saw some of the early photographs of just the accommodation.
Yeah.
That most of the early British Muslims and British Hindus, Sikhs lived in. It was just dire.
Exactly.
And so obviously that's where the focus had to go.
Indeed. We've got a question here for well, it can be to either one of you. Was Woking Mosque a modernist one where Sufism had no role? Who wants to jump in on that? Dr. Gilham, do you want to have a go?
I just kind of wanted to add a corrective to the
yes,
last,
please.
That Headley's children didn't. I think you might have said that Headley's children converted.
No, I didn't.
No, Ron didn't. I think Tarek maybe just in passing.
No.
One of the key catchphrases was that there was no compulsion in religion, and it's very rare to find any of those converts that their children. So there wasn't even a second generation in most cases. It's incredibly rare. I'm sorry, I'm going off on one, but
so was Sufism a role? Did Sufism play a role in the Woking Mosque? Is really the question here, I think.
I think I'm happy to let Ron answer this, but I don't believe it had a significant role at all, and it was rarely discussed in the Islamic Review either. I'm always quite surprised how little coverage it got.
Yeah.
So I believe that Sufism did not have a role at Woking.
Okay, we'll leave it at that because we've got more questions coming in. And this one is again for you, Dr. Gilham. Was Headley, and we've got Pictal thrown in as well, influenced by a modernist Ahmadiyya version of Islam, in your opinion?
A modernist
Ahmadiyya version of Islam?
The semantics. I mean, I can't. I'm not talking for Pictol. I don't want to conflate the two, actually. But Headley was influenced by a modernist version of Islam, as propagated through Kamal Uddin,
who, as we've discussed, wasn't necessarily propagating Ahmadiyya.
Well, he wasn't.
Exactly.
He wasn't, in terms of converts, he was not.
Indeed. Now we've got a question here from Brother Yahya, who was on one of our episodes recently. In the story of British Islam, where should we place Kamal Uddin and Headley? So, Professor Geaves, if you can tell us where we should place Kamal Uddin, and then we'll let Dr. Gilham handle the Headley side.
Where do we place them? Well, I think there are a number of people that we need to place historically in terms of being exceptional figures or giants, if you want, in the cementing of Islam as a faith, not as a culture, but as a faith in the UK. And in that respect, I think it's very, very important that we pick up. I mean, there are others, but that for me is what is central about them. William comes in, for me, also comes into that category. So,
and you, Dr. Gilham, are you in complete agreement, or do you want to add something?
No, I absolutely agree. I mean, in terms of Headley, I think he, along with many others, but he was a courageous guy. He stood up, and he was held to account on many occasions for what he said were his weaknesses and his transgressions, and also for his defense of Islam. So these were, in my view, quite courageous people. But he wasn't the only one. I'm not saying he was the most important. And as I said during the talk, he was not a scholar of Islam. I wouldn't conflate him with someone like Pictol, for example.
Yeah. And I think Brother Yahya wants to ask a direct question. So Mijamba, if you can unmute him.
No, that's sorry. No, I wasn't. That was my question. Sorry, there's no need to.
Okay, no problem. So while we wait for a couple of questions, I did say that I wanted to also talk about the project quickly. So Mijan, if you can just bring up the last slide, and after that, if we don't have any questions, we can wrap it up then. The last slide that I had up on, so is it up yet, Mijan? Hello. Yeah. So as you can see, folks, the Shah Jahan Mosque, through these three key men, really did become a centre for Islam across Europe, and it's such a huge part of Britain's Muslim heritage, as the discussion has clearly made clear there. We seem to be losing some of it. Okay, it's there. So now I'll briefly show you the resources available to those wanting to connect with all the heritage that we've been speaking about concerning Woking today. So starting in the top left-hand corner there, when you're looking at the screen, you can see we have, then we're going to move clockwise, we have a special revival edition of the Islamic Review that was produced as part of this project, which was conducted by the Everyday Muslim project. And this special revival issue, which of course is based on the original magazine founded by the Khwaja, has a number of articles discussing the topics that we've covered in this series. And of course, writers in the issue, in the magazine, amongst the writers are our two guests today, Professor Geaves and Dr. Gilham. And this is available to download as a PDF. The physical copies are now gone, I'm afraid. Then moving right, we also collected the oral histories of many locals, and they're stored in archives, including the National Archives. Moving across again, we produced a guide on how to preserve and archive our histories, which is a document that helps mosques, madrasas and other institutes learn how to develop this culture of archiving and preserving our histories as we move forward. Because of course it's not just about what's been and gone, we need to make sure we document and record what's happening right now. Beneath that, we have the trail maps that I've spoken about before. And then to the left of that, you will see a traveling exhibition that was created by the project. And this exhibition covers all of the history and heritage that we've been speaking about, about concerning Woking, and it can be rented by anybody and taken anywhere up and down the country. And finally, to the left, I know it might not be easy to see, but these are actual examples of lesson plans we've created to teach some of this history to school children, and can be picked up by both secondary school teachers and madrasa teachers, and used to educate people about some of Britain's Muslim heritage. Okay, we're going to go back quickly to a couple of questions because I've seen them pop up. But just to finish, all of the stuff I've just told you about is available on the Everyday Muslim website. So please do go over there and check out the pages concerning the Woking project. So we've got a question here now from Reardon, I think. My question is about, and this is to you, Dr. Gilham, my question is about who had religious legitimacy to adapt Islamic practices at the Woking Mosque. So, and then he's saying directly to you, you wrote in the Everyday Muslim's homage to the Islamic Review that Headley discussed the adaptability of Islam in relation to observance in the West of the 5 pillars. In your paper, you mentioned elasticity regarding daily salah times and alcohol. Were these the Khwaja's positions, or could he have been influenced by Headley for his rules? In this sense, regarding religious adaptations to the West, who mentored who? Good luck with that one, sir.
Well, I think it is true that Kamal Uddin influenced Headley in terms of he allowed him to think that, or to believe that there was an elasticity, to use that word, in Islam. So he did take it, as far as I know, he took his cue from Kamal Uddin. Thereafter, it was Headley's call. He basically talked about Muslims and converts in particular abiding by the laws of their own country, but also respecting the customs and having a kind of pragmatic engagement with Islam and the practice of Islam in particular. And he banged on and on about the pragmatics, the essentials of Islam, rather than practicing the details of Islam. So obviously it suited him as a convert of a particular kind of class and generation, but I believe that it was Kamal Uddin who did influence his position. But his thinking evolved over time. On alcohol, for example, many of the converts certainly drank alcohol. Headley initially said, that's fine, we should drink alcohol in moderation. And then his position changed over 15 or so years, and at the end he basically said that we should abstain from alcohol. So it wasn't things
changed over the course of his life, clearly. Now I've got a question just to Marcus there. So Marcus, concerning Dr. Leitner, how is he? I mean, we've spoken clearly here about how his role within Britain's Muslim heritage and how maybe many Muslims in Britain perceive him. How is he perceived in the Jewish community?
Oh, he's hardly known. I mean, he's one of these. Well, he's hardly known by anybody, but he's particularly not known in the Jewish community. I mean, I've studied Jewish history and heritage for 30 years. I hadn't come across him before I joined him in the Jewish Country House project and came to Woking Mosque. So it was a revelation finding out about him. Part of the problem was that there was not much background research on Leitner. So I mean, I filled in a lot of the details about his religious background and his Jewishness. There have been other, very good articles, but I think that was necessary. So no, he's one of his great unsung, unrecognized figures, and I think he's very much someone for today, someone who's got religious vision. He's inclusive, he's tolerant, he's promoting different people. I mean, there's a lot to like about him. Do you think
the fact that he was so how can I put it, evasive about his religious allegiance, do you think that played any role at all?
I'm not sure that he was evasive. I mean, I don't think he could really decide if he was one thing or another. As I say, in the 19th century, there was a growth in this, what was called semi-religious movement, at one extreme, you've got people saying religion is just about morality. So you've got the great 19th century higher criticism thinkers who said, you've got to get rid of the chaff and retain the kernel of religion. People like Schleiermacher and the German theologian. So you've got that very rationalistic view of religion, through to the other end, people like Blavatsky, who are seeing religion in a very generalized spiritual way. We're truth seekers. God can speak for various religions. So Leitner sat probably somewhere in the middle of that, but closer to the more rationalistic side of things. So he expressed a particular educated view of the 19th century view of religion, of someone who'd been to university and been influenced by both the Haskalah movement and by higher criticism. So yes, it's complex, but I say in terms of his personal life and practice and the example of tolerance and so on, he is a remarkable figure. It's not to say he didn't have his issues. He can be quite controlling in the early days as to how Woking mosque was used, and he was very trenchant in popular publications to say that he didn't encourage multiple marriages, with taking more than one partner, and so he was anxious to show that the Islam practice in his mosque didn't rock the boat, so to speak. But right. I suppose some of that was necessary to say that they were respecting local culture. But no, I think everybody should get to know Leitner.
Yes, I think many people will after this discussion. Thank you so much for that, Marcus. We've got one more very quickly, and it's from another one of our guests recently, who's probably looking for a nice piece of heritage to stick on one of his Muslim history tours, because he wants to know, is it known why the Khwaja had set up base in Notting Hill? Professor Geaves, do you know?
No, I don't know the answer to that.
and Dr. Gilham, any ideas? Do any of us know here?
Do you mean they had a temporary venue in Notting Hill Gate? Is that the point?
Maybe that's what Abdul Malik Taylor's talking about. He said his question says why Khwaja had set up base in Notting Hill.
They hired a hall, which was a popular meeting place.
Right.
But that part of West London, it certainly seemed to attract some interesting people in terms of religious thinkers and free thinkers. So I don't know if there's a connection there. Maybe right.
So we don't have a definitive answer, Mr. Taylor, I'm afraid, but that's the best we can do for now. Thank you so much. So thank you all for your questions, and please don't forget to join us for our 5th episode at 6 p.m. next week, when we will have 3 experts discussing those visitors to Britain even the academics and historians often overlook: the travellers, the Lascars, the Ayers, and imperial soldiers. And to register for that, it's the same process as it was for this episode. Thank you all again for joining us. Thank you again to our guests, Marcus Roberts, Professor Geaves, and Dr. Gilham. We hope you all have a great evening. Goodbye and salams. Thank you.